love research compliance as much as we do. We have some great updates to share with everyone today. Could we have the next slide, please? So we're going to start with a few updates from the Data Stewardship Subcommittee from Jen Welch. We'll talk a little bit about some general updates on the Animal Care and Use Subcommittee, have an overview of the CUSP sharing site and their recent progress, the Universal Protocol Template, or UPT. Amanda Humphrey is going to share the outcome of the MOU sample working group for use between collaborating institutions using vertebrate animals. And then as time allows, with the remaining time we have, we'll talk about some of the new and exciting changes in the responsible conduct of research training requirements and what FDP might be able to do to be helpful in this space. Next slide, please. I suppose I should have introduced myself at the start of the session, but I'm Melissa Korf. I'm Senior Director for Research Contracts, Data, and Security at Harvard Medical School, and I'm also co-chair of the Research Compliance Committee. And I'm going to hand it off to Jen Welch from Brown University to give us our Data Stewardship Subcommittee updates.
Thank you, Melissa. I hope everyone's having a wonderful and productive meeting week. My name is Jen Welch. I'm a co-chair for the Data Stewardship Subcommittee, and Chris Martin is our other co-chair, but I'll be providing our updates today. Next slide, please. Our D2A working group has truly been hard at work. They've continued to meet every other Friday, and they've now produced 3 documents. The first is a flowchart for determining if a D2A is required or recommended. The second is a revised FAQ document with new questions and answers. And the last is a checklist for use when reviewing outgoing data transfer requests. Last month, the working group emailed these documents out to the listserv asking for feedback. If you haven't had a chance to review the documents and share them with others within your institution, please do so and send them to d2a@ftp.org by this Thursday, which is the 15th. If you didn't receive the documents and you'd like to review them, please also reach out to the D2A email. And in addition to these documents, the working group is also planning to take a renewed look at the one-way D2A template. They'll soon be sending out a survey, which will be a chance to provide feedback on terms, language, structure, really anything in the template, which has been an issue during use. So please keep an eye out for that survey. And that's it for our updates. Thank you so much.
All right, thanks so much, Jen. Moving on to some of the updates from our Animal Care and Use Subcommittee. And I suppose I should say, at any point that anyone has any questions, comments, thoughts, please feel free to share that with us in the chat. We'll either answer or refer to that question, during the updates, or turn to those at the end. This is one of those informal meetings where we're able to just more chat with each other. So as of right now, the Animal Care and Use Subcommittee is co-chaired by Axel Wolf and Ara Tomasian. Next slide, please. And I think Ara was going to be able to join us today, but I'm not sure if he's here right now. But we wanted to give just a really, not enough words in the world to give enough thanks to Ara Tomasian for his just numerous years of service to this important subcommittee, and countless contributions to our shared goal of reducing the administrative burden associated with animal subjects research. His participation with this committee has had such an impact over the years. Unfortunately, he's let us know that due to some other obligations, he's got to step down from that role, and what big shoes he's going to leave to fill. Axel, I don't know if you wanted to say any words now as well.
Well, yeah, I would like to echo what you just said. I thank Ara for helping with these important initiatives in animal research and the reduction of burden, and we're seeing our 3 big projects all moving along at different speeds, but all contributing to this goal. And some of them are direct responses to the 21st Century Cures Act, and we're hoping to move these projects, once they're completed, eventually into the public domain after it's been vetted through FDP. And I think we're right on track, and I'm hoping we can get another chair soon, while the one project's wrapping up and the other two are well along, and it would be helpful to have somebody else apply for this important position.
Thank you, Axel. And so an email is in preparation to go out to both the research compliance and the animal care and use listservs. So if you are interested in either this leadership opportunity or other potential volunteer opportunities with any of the research compliance subcommittees, or with any of the projects that you hear about today, make sure to sign up on those listservs, and further information about the application materials that are required and a little bit more detail about sort of the expectations of a co-chair role will be sent out to those listservs shortly. But materials will be due Friday, October 21st, and you can feel free to reach out to me at the email address on the slide if you've got any questions, would like to express interest, or otherwise just generally interested in volunteer opportunities. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to pass the mic, so to speak, on to Aubrey Schoenleben to share with us an update on progress on the Compliance Unit Standard Protocol, or CUSP, sharing site. This is one of those really exciting projects that Axel talked about that has really great promise to reduce administrative burden. Aubrey?
Thanks, Melissa. Hi, everybody. My name's Aubrey. I'm with the University of Washington, and I am one of the co-chairs of the CUSP project, along with Sally Thompson-Iritani. And so the plan for today is I'm going to just start with some really brief background for any new folks in the audience, and then I'll give you an update on what we've been working on since we met last in May. Next slide, please. All right, so the goal of the CUSP project really is just to create an online venue where participating institutions can share standard procedures that are used in animal care protocols. And as Melissa and Axel mentioned, this is one of the burden reducing initiatives that was outlined in the 21st Century Cures Act. Next slide, please. And we think that developing this resource will have a number of benefits for our community. First and foremost, we think that it'll reduce administrative burden for investigators, for IACUCs and IACUC support staff by decreasing the amount of time it takes to put together a high quality animal care protocol and get it through the review process, which is often identified as one of the number one sources of burden related to IACUCs and animal research is the animal use protocol. Additionally, we think the use of standard procedures will help to increase consistency, not only within a given institution, but also across institutions, which is becoming increasingly more important as our research environment is more and more collaborative these days. And then lastly, really the intent is just to support knowledge sharing within our community. So, if Melissa or Axel has a really good plan for a survival surgery that I need for my research, there's no point in me kind of having to write up that description from scratch. I can use that plan that Melissa and Axel have as is, if that fits my needs, or I can use that as a really good starting point and then just kind of tweak details as needed to fit my particular research needs. Next slide, please. All right, so what is the current status of the project? So I put this little timeline together. It's probably familiar to many of you that have been following along, but I like it because it gives a nice sense of where the project has been and kind of where we're headed. So our working group formed way back in March of 2017. And we are currently in site development and testing, and hopefully it's not too ambitious to say that we're in the last stretch of development for the site, which is super exciting. So kind of the big news over the summer was that our developer informed us that he was no longer able to support our project. So we had to find a new developer. And so quite fortunately, we were able to engage a new developer rather quickly. And so a huge thank you to Lynette Arias and Chris Renner for their efforts on that end. That's been hugely helpful. Our new developer, Josh, is fantastic. He has gotten up to speed incredibly quickly. And is off to a great start and sends us these fun little video updates every 2 weeks, kind of on his development project progress. So that's been really nice. He's starting off by just fixing some of those bugs that we identified kind of in the last round of testing that we completed, as well as tackling just some of the low-hanging fruit that's sort of left on our development task list, such as adding sort capabilities on data tables, that sort of thing, just so he can kind of get in the system and get very familiar with it. So that's progressing really nicely. And kind of in parallel with that, we're starting to think again about kind of this next round of testing, hopefully this last round of testing, kind of on this bit of development work here. And we're anticipating that this initial build will be completed by the end of the year, which is a really exciting thought. Next slide, please. So in addition to that development work, our working group has been really active over the last few months, and I just wanted to highlight some of their accomplishments. So our education and outreach team, which is being led by Michelle Brott from the University of Washington and Scott Burry from Vanderbilt, they have finalized or are really close to finalizing a one-pager, which you kind of see in that little screenshot there, which is just kind of just one page about what CUSP is and how it can help you, just to provide to institutions that are just interested in kind of learning about the site. They're also preparing for a very busy fall season ahead. There's a number of outreach efforts planned, including a neighbor webinar that Sally and I will be doing in mid-October. We'll also be at the ALAS meeting and the Priminar meetings, presenting on kind of our progress with CUSP. The help desk team, which is being chaired by April Ripka from Penn State, as well as Julie Sharp from UCSF. Julie is a new co-chair, and so I also just wanted to say welcome, Julie. For those of you that know Julie, Julie's amazing. And a big thank you to Elaine Kim from Colorado State. She was one of the original co-chairs and was just instrumental in just helping this project go along, but she needed to step down. She transferred to a new job opportunity recently, which was very exciting for her. So our help desk team has been really working with our tech team to develop an intake form for problem reports and enhancement requests, and kind of figuring out a triaging system then based on that form. And they're also kind of revisiting the different help documentation and FAQs that they've started to develop for users of the site, just based on the new user interface with this transition to the new technology stack. And then we have the quality control team, which is being chaired by Eva McGee from Charles Drew University. Their big accomplishment over this past couple months was finally finalizing this user survey that we've been working on for a long while now. So that was fantastic. And they're currently now developing an implementation plan for that survey, which is just a nice step forward. And then in our technical systems team, which is chaired by Mark Nath and Cindy Rosenblatt. So in addition to working with the help desk team, they're also working on building out a template for institutions to be able to import and export procedures into and out of the site. So it's probably looking like it's going to just be a simple Excel sort of template to use with a CSV upload download sort of system. And they're also taking on the task of looking at some sort of integrated working group tools, because we use Slack and we use Trello and we use Google Drive, and just kind of figuring out if there's a way that we can kind of integrate all those pieces just for easier working amongst all of us. Next slide, please. All right, and then a couple of our goals for this quarter. So the first on our list is really to finalize this terms of service and privacy policy document that we chatted about in May. We got some really good feedback from the executive committee on those documents, and in particular, Alex Albanek and our very own Melissa were really, really helpful in providing some guidance on just separating out kind of individual user and participant responsibilities from institutional responsibilities. And so with that in mind, we're working on developing a memorandum of understanding that institutions will kind of sign whenever they kind of join the CUSP site, and that'll outline kind of all the responsibilities and kind of expectations that we have for institutions participating in the site. So our hope is to kind of make some good progress on that over this next quarter and hopefully finalize that soon. We're also continuing some really good conversations with kind of how we can use CUSP to support use of research with non-typical species. So in particular, we've been working closely with the cephalopod research community, which is, many of you know, that's not a group of species that's currently regulated, but they have expressed a need to share best practices kind of amongst themselves and kind of figuring out how can we develop the system to also support that community. So they've given us some, really nice feedback along the way as we're developing procedure types and kind of organizational categories within the system to make sure that it supports their work as well. And we've also started some good conversations with the clinical and surgical techniques or CAST group within the primate community. So that's a consortium of primate veterinarians, and they essentially kind of create best practices around different surgical techniques that are used in primate research models. And so kind of figuring out how we can use CUSP to support sharing of information kind of on that front as well. And then last but certainly not least, as you can see from that little picture, we're also starting to look forward and think about the pilot phase for the CUSP project, as well as plans for initial rollout to the FDP community, and starting to kind of think about and nail down kind of more specifics, since that'll be upon us before we know it, which is fantastic. And I think that is my last slide. I believe the next one is just a thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions if there are questions.
So I have one, Aubrey.
Yeah, of course.
I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about who all the site will be available to, and how you're thinking about how access will be managed.
Sure. So that access question kind of comes in two flavors. So I guess at the broadest level is kind of which institutions will have access. So because we're developing this in conjunction with FDP members will have kind of access first, I guess. The first phase of access will be opened up to FDP institutions. And then kind of once all of those institutions have joined CUSP, then we'll open it up to other research institutions, since we are supported through NIH, and it is a burden reducing initiative, the 21st Century Cures Act. We are opening it up to everybody. But in terms of who within an institution has access, when we had conversations about this way back when, there were lots of very strong opinions on the whole spectrum. And so we opted to leave that decision up to the institution. So each institution can decide if they want to give access to researchers at their institution, or if they want access to just be within their IACUC support staff or their IACUC, their veterinarians. They can kind of manage that at their level. And so we'll have 3 different user roles within the system then to support, I I guess, that variability. So each institution will be expected or required to have what we're calling a designated institutional representative. And so that individual will be responsible then for managing accounts at their home institution and kind of implementing whatever local policy they have about access.
And for FDP member institutions that aren't part of your most excellent working group, that might be thinking about convincing their institution to participate once they have the option to do so. What do you think the timeline looks like for, what would you call the people after beta users? Users who are interested in using the site. When do you think that that might become an option?
So I guess I'll just put the disclaimer that this is my personal thoughts, and I still need to check in with our development team and kind of our steering committee and make sure others are on board. But I'm thinking if we can get our initial build completed by the end of the year, that we'll do a pilot phase probably the first quarter of next year. And then, assuming all goes well, then maybe after that, we could open it up to FDP members. So maybe Q2, if we're Q2 of 23.
That sounds great.
Yeah.
I don't see any other questions in the chat right now. But by all means, Aubrey is going to stay on with the session. So if folks have comments or questions, I think we can still address those later. But if we want to move on to the next slide, Sarah.
Thanks.
And we're going to pass it on to Bill Greer, who's going to give us an update on the Universal Protocol template. Bill?
Thank you, Melissa. And it's great to be here. Great to chat about the Universal Protocol template. I'm a co-chair of this subcommittee. I'm from the University of Michigan. My partner in crime is Ron Banks. Ron's now retired, so I'm going to try and put him to work even more. So with that, let's go to the next slide, please. So I wanted to give you guys an idea of the last year. So I had a really bad bout with COVID, and I didn't get back to work till May or early April. So it kind of delayed progress on the project. And what I've done for the last couple of months was go back and revisit some of our notes and took a look at some of the things that we've done as part of the working group and organize things. So soon after this meeting here in September, I want to try and get us together again. So with that, I think I'll give you a historical perspective on the UPT for those that are just hearing about this the first time, some ideas behind it, then a status update and some next step ideas, and then some of our thoughts for moving forward. So next slide, please. So not to put in a plug for the IACUC Administrators Association, but I wanted to throw a slide in here so you were familiar with what I was talking about. It is an organization that we use to collectively gather thoughts from the IACUC administrative community. And some time ago, this idea of a universal protocol template form came up. And as a result, we took some action and it eventually developed into an FDP project. So with that, let's jump to the next slide. So why a UPT? So again, for about 8 years, we as a community of IACUC administrators and compliance directors kicked around the idea of having a common protocol form that we would use between institutions. Obviously, the idea is, if the IACUC reviewed a form at my institution and it was a common template that was being used at your institution, at least the document was very similar and the same concepts and philosophies were being covered in the specific set of questions. So in 2016, we formalized the project and we talked more to the community and started to develop a document based on something that Axel Wolf developed years ago that is currently a resource on OLAW's website. And we spent a couple of years going through that document with our community and developing a form that we called the Universal Protocol Template. At that time, there was a suggestion that we partner with FDP to even formalize this a little more. Hence, we pulled together this subcommittee, and we've continued to work diligently trying to create a form that is something that would be acceptable for many, many different institutions, and more importantly, institutional philosophies. And I'll get to that in a second. So let's jump to the next slide. Quick disclaimer, just because we're working on what may be a universal protocol template form, once it's finalized, that doesn't mean that OLAW nor the USDA will expect anyone to use it. It will not be mandated. Our goal basically is to update a resource that OLAW has on its website. Our subcommittee includes Axel and also Bob Gibbons for the USDA. So, our federal partners are weighing in on this. And then once this document is prepared, the idea is to have it available for institutions to grab and use as they see fit. Maybe they use all the questions, maybe they use half the questions, maybe they modify the questions. It's up to them, but at least for us to have a current resource that reflects the changes that we've experienced in the compliance community over the years. So let's jump to the next slide, please. So what are the objectives? One of the things that we learned through discussions with the administrative community is that a lot of things that are being asked and the questions or the answers expected are almost verbatim from institution to institution. The other note that we made was, according to NABOR's website, about 98% of the protocols that we manage involve the use of mice and rats. So we wanted to try to develop a document that was simpler to use for PIs and IACUCs, that included a lot of text or check boxes, and only ask PIs to add information or enter information into a text box, paragraph form where required or necessary. So you'll see how that philosophy evolves as we go through the slides. Having said that, just because it is tailored toward mice and rats, that doesn't mean it's only usable for institutions that are looking at mice and rats. We have developed it in a way that it expands across all species. Just more information may need to be added for swine, primates, or some of the other vertebrate animals that we see come up at our institutions. So let me jump to the next slide. So some important notes. We want to make sure that all the information that we're requesting as part of the UPT is consistent with the regulatory requirements and regulatory policies. That's why it's important for us to have Axel and Bob involved, and others that are in federal roles, just to weigh in and give us some ideas. We want to make sure the information that we gather is relevant to the review and approval of the animal activities. So as we look through it, we realize that some things we collect through the protocol form are related to compliance. And unfortunately, the only way we can get that information is through the form. So ideally, we streamline this document to get what we need to get from PIs and what IACUCs need to review the animal activities. So let's jump on to the next slide. So considering the wording, we wanted to keep it as simple as possible, easily understood by whomever the reader is, whether it's the PI trying to figure out what needs to go in the document, or it's the IACUC reviewing it. Again, I want to reiterate that the idea for this document is to provide the IACUC all the information they need to review and approve the proposed animal activities. So we wanted to make sure that we got into the weeds as necessary for IACUCs to do and perform their function of review. We tried to logically format it. We put it in sections where the administrative information is info that we need as a compliance office perhaps, and we'll give you some examples. Some of the research objectives and why animals need to be used. Then maybe the animal procedures, you know, how are they being performed? Can we use a checkbox, or do we need someone to describe it in the form of a written text? Departures, hazardous material use, some of the things that you routinely see and you're used to seeing within a protocol form. Next slide. Once we have the document together through part 5 of our review, we want to make sure that we have a regulatory review. We want to make sure that the questions do satisfy OLAW and USDA expectations. We want to make sure that we're not making assumptions, and where we make assumptions that OLAW and the USDA agree. We have VA and DOD involved as much as we can. We want to make sure we have input from them, considering there are nuances that we need to respect and be aware of as it relates to VA review of their forms and the format of their forms, as well as DOD. We want to think about the PIs and make sure the questions make sense to PIs. We want to ask it in a manner that is PI friendly and not compliance heavy. And we want to make sure that the document does satisfy the committee's needs. In other words, the IACUC has all the information it needs, not just from the perspective of the scientific and non-affiliated members, but also the veterinary members, so that they understand everything from humane endpoints to other things relevant to what the veterinarians are looking for when they're reviewing protocols. Then what we'd like to try to do is a final document user testing and get weigh-in from researchers, then get weigh-in from veterinarians, from administrators, committee members, and then the compliance directors, and tweak things as necessary and try to refine the best that we can. We go to the next slide. So the progress that we've made thus far is, as mentioned, we developed a UPT form that we're using as our base document. And this was developed through the administrative community. It is actually the form that we're using in the working group to refine and develop. We did develop the FDP working group. We have around 25 people on it, and we have met electronically 3 times to go over the form and talk about questions. Prior to that, I did send it out and just asked for input via email so that I could get a general idea of what each individual thought. And we collated that information and also made it available for the conference calls that we went through as a working group. Then at that point, we were delayed by the pandemic. So I'm going to kind of move forward from there. Let's jump to the next slide. So this is kind of an outline of the document, and I touched on this a little bit. We do currently have it in sections, with the administrative questions coming first, going through species information, general animal activity descriptions, and then descriptions of the procedures, departures, justifications, like I said, hazardous material use, different acknowledgements and things like that. By acknowledgements, I mean the potential to use assurances like, yeah, I as the PI agreed to train, for example, all of my staff, or assure they're trained before they begin working with animals independently. So we're weighing out the use of these assurance statements as well and how effectively they can be used. We jump to the next slide. Here's a couple of examples of what the questions look like. And Section 1, Section 2, you can see in Section 1, which is an administrative question, and Section 2, which is administrative, we're looking for, information for contact. We need to know the PI's name, department, cell phone numbers, things that you've all seen on your protocol forms. This is information that we can only get from the PI. Same thing with funding source. A lot of us do protocol grant congruency reviews. Consequently, we need to at least have some information about the grants, funding source, which grant is applicable to which protocol. and give us the ability to do those congruency reviews when necessary. Next slide. So here again is an opportunity for us to think about what information we can only acquire from the PIs. So it's easy for us or those institutions that have all of their work done in vivarium space, maybe in procedure rooms dedicated to the animal users, but larger institutions such as the University of Michigan, we have activities conducted in laboratories across campus. So the only way that we know this is to gather it through the protocol form. So you can see the idea behind this is to gather the information that we need, not necessarily as part of an IACUC review, but that we need to document. So when the IACUC does, for example, semi-annual inspections, we know where to go. So here we're just asking, are you going to work outside of defined space, i.e. your laboratory? If so, tell us what you're going to do, where the building and room number is. And then the IACUC administrator or the director of the compliance program can enter this into a database. And when we schedule our semi-annual inspections, we're able to use it. So again, this is information that is necessary to maintain compliance, but maybe not important to the IACUC when reviewing the actual animal activities. So let's jump to the next slide, please. Here's where we get into some of the animal information. We want to know where the animals are coming from, what species are being used. So this is relevant to the committee. There are a lot of different nuances that we've learned as we've talked to members in our working group that are important to the institutions. So this just kind of gives us, it's a short list here, but it evolved through some of our discussions. But you know, where are you getting your animals? Are they coming from an already approved protocol? Is it wildlife studies? Are you using commercial vendors or other? Again, information that we would need as a committee to understand what species are being used and evaluate the appropriateness of the species. Next slide. So here's some routine questions that all of us probably read every day, maybe an iteration of these. So briefly provide the goal and general description of the project in language that can be easily understood by a layperson. Describe the importance of the project as it relates to human animal health. Explain your rationale for using animals. So all of this information are things that we need to consider as committees, not necessarily related to an animal activity, yet something the IACUC must verify when they're doing their review. So we've tried to look at various ways that folks ask these questions from institution to institution and just come up with a very brief and direct way to ask the question and yet satisfy the goal for each of these expectations as it relates to IACUC review. Next slide. Here's where we get into some general animal activities. We're talking more about the experimental design and the importance of it. How much do we really need to know about the experiment itself as it relates to the animal activities that are being conducted? So we've got a lot of conversation going on about this. With that, I will say that it's up in the air whether or not we need to have a traditional experimental design the way that we've seen it historically, you know, by group 1, group 2, group 3, and things like that. Or is it more important for us to make sure that we are looking at the number of animals needed and the animal activities that are being performed? So don't have a lot that I can give you on the experimental design yet, any more than we are still thinking about what it needs to look like as part of this universal form. So let's jump to the next slide, please. So procedure questions, here's a couple of examples of what we're trying to do. Please identify the method of euthanasia that will be used. And you can see in this particular example, since a lot of mouse and rat users euthanize their animals by CO2 asphyxiation or maybe isoflurane, and then follow with some sort of physical method as a secondary. We tried to create an opportunity for the PI just to check a box, and in which case the IACUC would understand that they're using a traditional means of euthanasia, gas asphyxiation, followed by an appropriate physical secondary method. The idea here again is to make things very simple for the PI, make things very simple for the IACUC when they review it, and then through our conversations with Axel and Bob and our group independently, we make sure that it complies with the regs. Again, another question focusing on blood collection. Please check all that apply. Again, we're looking at the types of animal activities that we can standardize using language that we see from institution to institution, give PIs the opportunity to just check a box and let IACUCs read it and understand that it is an acceptable method without going through 2 or 3 paragraphs trying to find maybe just this little piece of information. Let's jump to the next question or the next slide. So now what we want to do, we're trying to address some struggles and trying to figure out next steps. We want to continue to discuss the role of the administrator and how that would impact what the protocol content looks like. A lot of changes have occurred over the years. The administrator has taken on a lot of different responsibilities under the direction of an IACUC, an attending veterinarian, or many others that run these programs. And then finally, I started to look at some of the conversations that we had amongst our working group and organize the document into an Excel file. And I'll show you a couple of examples and explain why I put them into the Excel file. So let's jump to the next slide. So when I say the struggles, I mean, struggle may be a harsh word, but I will say that some of our working group discussions, we've spent 2-3 hours going through 2 or 3 questions. And the idea is that we've got a lot of different people with a lot of different ideas, and we are holding on to the old ideas. So one of the things that we're trying to do is think outside of the box, but it is a natural tendency for us to think about our own protocol forms, the ones that we're used to. And we have a very specific reason why we ask every single question. So ideally, what we're trying to do as a group is to put that aside and think about this UPT form from the perspective of what does the IACUC need and what do we need to gather from the PIs. So let's jump to the next slide. And you'll see what we've done is we've put some of these questions in the form of an Excel sheet. And I'm going to continue through this and we'll figure out what the final format of the document looks like, whether it's just an Excel sheet that people can grab questions they want to use, or we put it into a Word document or whatever. But right now I wanted to organize it this way so that we can see the kinds of things that are discussed. This particular slide right here, this is just 1, 2, and 3. I think we spent an entire meeting on this, going through what we thought would be a very simple thing and what makes sense. So for that reason, we soon realized that we need to think about a way to organize this so that we are accommodating everyone's needs, and then maybe come back and revisit it as we continue to progress to the end of the UPT. Let me go to the next slide and you'll see that I added a few comments and you'll see what I mean. Like originally, this particular statement, very first statement, please check yes to provide written documentation and assurance that all personnel listed on this protocol will be under the supervision of and be trained by a qualified and experienced individual before they're permitted to conduct any animal procedures listed on the protocol. So the idea here was potentially to make this just an attestation statement and to say yes or no. Obviously, people are going to check yes. Then a lot of questions came up as part of a discussion for this particular question as to, do we need to identify who's doing the training? Do we need to identify their qualifications? So all of these things may be relevant. We make some assumptions that if people that are training them are trained, then if they're already approved on the protocol, we already know they're trained because that's a requirement. Then if they're doing the training, should be okay. Not everyone was comfortable with that. So again, we're going to try and develop this document in a way that we have some comments and things to consider, plus the questions that we are asking. For example, third red square down, administrator confirms so probably unneeded. So to ensure the facilitation of high quality science and welfare, the ICOOC has established minimum training requirements, including things that must be satisfied before the protocol can begin. Specialized trainings, for example. So as the PI, please check yes to provide assurance. So some of these trainings, or many of these trainings, are things that we or the ICOOC administrator confirms that the training has been completed before the protocol is approved. Consequently, this is something that goes on behind the scenes. So is it important to have this statement in the protocol? Some say yes, some say no. So again, we are trying to work on this in a way that we offer ideas for every question, and we are challenged with streamlining this down to, at least to the satisfaction of everybody involved in the committee. So we're going to continue to work on this. Next slide, please. So again, where are we? So I already mentioned the draft form is done. We've already divided this into sections. We've had some subcommittee meetings. I've been working getting this document into a Excel form where I can share this with our subgroup and have some conversation about it, develop it out, and then think about whether or not we can pare it down even more. I think we have some, considering the timing of the last 3 meetings and the robust conversations that we had, we'll get this into an Excel form, and I foresee us having more conversations and continuing to streamline the document as much as we can to whatever comfort we can come up with, you know, based on all the personalities and all the institutions involved. Next slide. I think that's it. I've talked about this a bit. So we will start up the Zoom meetings again very soon. I'm going to distribute some electronic documents for people to take a look at so that when we get to our Zoom meetings, we're prepared with some of our comments and points to talk about. Ultimately, once we get an acceptable document, we get it into a format that we can do the user testing and then make it available to the community. I think that's all, Melissa. Yes. So any questions from anyone?
Thanks so much, Bill. So one quick question. You mentioned your working group. Are you guys full up, or are you potentially looking for additional volunteers to join you to help get the work back going?
I mean, I'm happy to add more people. I don't want to deter anyone. I can tell you that we've got a large group, and that means we have a lot of opinions, and I think that's part of what's kind of challenging, to get some language that we can at least get out there for user testing. And having said that, I don't know how much this document will be used by our institutions. Is it going to be a resource where people grab things from it? But we want to make sure that it's right and it's efficient and can be efficiently used. So I've not turned anyone away. I've said to some that have asked, if you want to be on the user testing group, I'll put you on the list. And we do have folks on that list. But I mean, to be fair, we've been working on this for a couple of years. And because of COVID, I was crippled with getting it moving last year, but I want to get it going again. And I think that, I appreciate everyone's input, and I'm willing to hear what folks say. But I think we're going to be challenged with a lot of different opinions from a lot of different institutions.
Thanks, Bill. So when you get to user testing, do you think that you've got enough folks on that list, or will we send a call out to our listserv?
I think we send a call out. We get as many, yes, there's probably a maximum, but I think if we can get up to 10 from each one of those groups to read it, I need veterinarians to read it with a veterinary perspective. I need IACUC administrators to read it from an administrative/compliance perspective. The IACUC from a perspective of, is it giving me the information I need to review and approve the protocol and the animal activities, various things like that.
Great. And I do see that there's one question that's popped up in the chat. How do you think the UPT will or could be used by institutions that use electronic protocol management systems?
Yeah, that's a great question, Steve. And I'll tell you that since we started this project, a lot of the solutions software developers have talked to us and contacted us. We've really avoided giving them, preliminary documents. I think they're very interested to see what it's going to look like and very interested to see what the community looks like as far as their receptiveness to using this form. But, obviously, some of these commercial products, the language is going to be up to the producer. Are they going to take some of these questions that we develop and standardize it from one commercial product to another? In some cases, it may be very simple if it's just the wording of a question. The other thing that we want to do is work with Aubrey and her team with CUSP to see how much of that we can roll into this as well and figure out what the right fit is for that. So I think there's going to be various phases. If we come up with a document and we do the user testing and we know this is what we need as a community, then the next steps are going to be working with solutions, the software folks, working with Aubrey and seeing how CUSP will work in this and things like that.
Yeah, and so I think you mentioned that there could be a little bit of sort of an option for institutions to kind of take from this form what works for them. So maybe that's one way that an institution that's using an electronic protocol management system, so if that system has like a smart form in it and it answers half the questions that are in the UPT, they could say, well, the other half of the questions are really important and we need you to attach a document that includes this or something like that.
Absolutely.
Could be one way that might be leveraged. So do we think that the form would be mandated for FDP institutions down the line?
It's, I made that disclaimer is really important. It was slide about 3 or 4. This will never be mandated. It's not the idea. We don't have the idea that we need to develop a form and say you must use it. The idea is that we develop a form that reflects some of the common language that's from institution to institution. If you want to use it and it works well for you at your institution, that's fine. I already know that OLAW and the USDA will not say you must use this. We've had that conversation. It's a resource, and it's just going to be an updated resource, and that's where we're at right now.
I don't want to put Axel on the spot, but maybe one of the potential benefits is if Axel could say, you could use this, and this would be compliant. That might give a lot of institutions comfort that if their form asks for additional questions, they might be able to let those questions go.
Right, just similar to how the VAS, the vertebrate animal section, we slimmed that down and went right back to the PHS policy to see what is really the absolute basic amount of information that's needed, and the group is going down that same path. What is the basic amount of information that's needed to obtain the compliant information? And then institutions can add whatever they want to meet their own needs. So that's why we keep saying it's not mandated, but you're right. If you use this form, by the time it's finally out on the street, it will meet the compliance expectations of USDA and OLAW.
And so institutions that are looking to streamline their forms or streamline their processes could gain comfort in looking at this form that that they could let go of some things that aren't on it, potentially.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that, I don't know how long all of you have been in the field. I've been in this field for 35 years, and I know that in the beginning, we tried to make the protocol the catch-all. And over the years, we've developed as institutions policies. And a really good example is a policy on training requirements. So in the past, we would say, list all of your expertise in a protocol form, and the IACUC would assess the training through the review process. But now at our institutions, we've identified specific trainings that need to be completed. We've identified processes within the compliance office to verify that everybody completed the training. And 9 out of 10 times, the IACUC has delegated that duty to the administrative office. And although the IACUC approves the protocol, the approval letter may be held until the administrator or the compliance director does in fact validate that everyone has the training. Consequently, we probably don't need to gather all of that information in the form anymore because we have another way of doing it. I can tell you that we bring some of these ideas up, and there are folks within our working group that are still very old school when they think it's very important to have that in the protocol form. So through that Excel sheet, I'm hoping that we can list the questions for the conservative folks that want it all, but then also list the primary questions that you must have in order to have a compliant form. So this resource needs to satisfy all of our needs. Those that want to catch all in the protocol, and those that are looking for the minimum needed, yet still compliant. So that is a philosophy that we're trying to observe as we think more and more about this document.
Thanks, Bill. And we've got one last question. I want to make sure that we move on to our next topic and make sure that
Sure.
it has enough time for the MOU. But one question in the chat is about just sort of maintenance for the document once it's finished. Would another working group be developed to review the form and make appropriate updates if a new regulation comes out? And I think the answer to that is probably yes. It's
Probably, yeah.
consistent with how FDP kind of maintains some of these documents. Would you agree?
I would agree.
Awesome. All right, if we can have the next slide, please, Sarah. Sarah is going to help us make sure that we keep the chat and everything. So if folks have additional questions for Bill or the UPT or any of our other topics, please feel free to go ahead and still put those in the chat. And if we aren't able to answer during the session, we'll make sure that we share answers afterwards. So I'm going to pass the mic off to Amanda Humphrey from Northeastern University now. She's going to give us an update on the MOU sample for use between collaborating institutions using vertebrate animals.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you, everyone. Bill, that's really exciting about the UPT, and I'll be excited to see what you guys come out with. So I just wanted to share an update about the MOU sample that has been discussed. It was posted earlier this year on the listserv. So what I'm just going to do today is give an update, a little bit of context around what it is, how it came about, and what our next steps will be in terms of this document that is now available on the FDP website. I want to thank Ara and Axel for their assistance and leadership with this. Our entire working group who spent a lot of hours, especially during COVID, helping us work through both the guidance document and the MOU sample, and two former co-chairs that have rolled off, Carrie Godin from now HMS and was at Brown, and Stephanie Scott from Columbia University. All right, next slide, please. So we'll just run through the context of the project, just so folks know how it came about, how we moved through the process of coming up with the MOU. We'll go through the MOU quickly, as well as the guidance, and then we'll talk a little bit about next steps. And as always, there's a time for question and answers. And if questions do come up, please feel free to interrupt me, Melissa, Sarah. Next slide, please. So we wanted to set the stage with the regulatory context of how these conversations first came about. Most institutions use the guide, as it's often called. The NIH OLA has incorporated the guide by reference. So not only NIH OLA follows the guide, but also all of the federal funding agencies that have letters of assurance or support services from OLA also leverage the guide since they are leveraging NIH's OLA documentation. And in the current version of the guide, we really wanted to highlight that this came from this section of the guide on page 15. Interinstitutional collaboration has the potential to create ambiguities about responsibility for animal care and use. In cases of such collaboration involving animal use beyond animal transport, the participating institution should have a formal written understanding, e.g. a contract, memorandum of understanding, or agreement that addresses the responsibility for off-site care and animal use, ownership, and IACUC review and oversight. In addition, IACUCs from the participating institutions may choose to review protocols for the work being conducted. And so, next slide, please. This actually came about when we were updating the subaward templates, and I used to be a subaward subcommittee co-chair, and some folks were asking, does the language that is currently in the FDP subaward meet the definition of what is currently in the guide? And after some discussion with some folks at OLA, we determined that what is currently in the FDP subaward as written probably does not meet the spirit of what the guide has implied needs to be shared. And so we started doing a little bit of work around this between both the subaward subcommittee as well as the IACUC subcommittee, and we started thinking about, what are some of the issues that we need to tackle here. And we started thinking about the interpretation of the requirements and how variable they can be, and how variable business processes might create operational gaps, and then just really making sure that we were focusing on the best possible care for animals. And then also talking a little bit about what type of document would we be talking about here? Should it live in the subaward? Should it live in another type of document? And that really came down to what different types of documents are intended to convey. An MOU is a little bit less binding per se than an actual formal contract or agreement. However, we were also thinking about things like the potential that MOUs or subawards might end up with conflicting terms, and then also review and signature time, depending on where these different documents might end up, which business process might be cleaner. And then one of the other important issues that we identified was reporting. OLA has required non-compliance reporting, but collaborating institutions may not be aligned as to who should do the reporting and if the collaborator should be notified. Next slide, please. So once we surfaced some of those questions around what types of administrative burden are floating around the edges of the MOU process versus another process, we started thinking about what OLA's specific expectations were. And one of OLA's responsibilities is conducting site visits at grantee institutions. If collaborative animal work is being performed, OLA will ask to examine the MOUs and or equivalent documents in place to ensure appropriate oversight, care, and use of vertebrate animals when the activity is supported by NIH. Now, I want to focus in on this when the activity is supported by NIH, because support does not always equal money. And support that can be work that is related to NIH funding, perhaps through unfunded collaboration, such as provision of expertise, contributions to data sets, interpreting data, etc. I personally have seen instances where we might have a project at an institution A, and at institution B, the actual animal studies research is being conducted using that faculty members' startup funds. It's not being funded by the NIH grant, but data is being exchanged between those two activities, and actually the data from institution B is integral to the work that is coming out of institution A, and that per the guide and per the interpretation that we've sought from OLA, would need to have some sort of documentation supporting that. So I know that some folks have said, hey, why don't you just update the subaward? It would just be so much more efficient to stick this language into the subaward and just deal with it that way. And so one of the key issues that comes up is that you may not always have an actual subaward because it may not be a funded relationship between the two parties. Next slide, please. And so here are really the ultimate questions that we came up with is ensuring that roles and responsibilities are defined when more than one institution is conducting work with vertebrate animals funded by the same grant. Or if there is no grant, if at the other institution, but it is supporting the activity of another institution's grant, how do you make sure that those roles and responsibilities are clear? What type of agreement should be used between the different institutions, and so that each individuals are aware of their role? And what is the least burdensome way to do this? Next slide, please. So in 2019, we actually hosted a webinar where we started talking through some of these issues, and we in particular sought community engagement and feedback, and we had a couple of polls in there just to make sure that we walked away with some data in addition to some of the anecdotal stories that people were able to share with us. So we asked questions of, does your institution issue MOUs when multiple institutions are working with vertebrate animals on the same research project? And then 89 of the 262 respondents said always. Even if there is a subaward, they will still issue a separate MOU. Next slide, please. So then we asked, oh, sorry, can you actually go to the slide after this? Because this I think is gonna, okay, great. So then we started asking about the operations of this, because we wanted to find out, even though MOUs were not currently maybe always being incorporated in through the subaward, or that intention was not always being incorporated in through the subaward, how could that happen? Is that possible given different institution structures and alignments? And so we asked the question about, how is operational alignment between your institution's IACUC office when issuing MOUs and the office that issues subawards? And 113 out of 271 respondents said the MOU process and the subaward process are mutually exclusive. They are not tied together at all. And that was consistent with some early data that we had received, where it was very clear to us that there were even times where the Office of the IACUC and the Office of Sponsored Programs didn't have systems that talked to each other. They didn't have reporting lines that fostered communication between those different offices, and several other factors that would have prevented the efficient flow of information from the Office of the IACUC over to the OSP, so that those things could easily talk to each other. And then if you could please go back a slide, Sarah, I'm so sorry. Okay, and then we did ask the question about, when you are a subrecipient on an NIH-funded project, where do you report any of the animal welfare issues? We had received some anecdotal evidence or comments from people that they just reported directly to OLA and they did not notify the PTE. And in several cases that had actually been problematic at the final stages of the project, because the lead faculty investigator was not aware that their subrecipient had several issues with their animal care and use. They didn't receive copies of the reports that eventually went to OLAW from the subrecipient, and so they were unaware of potential data issues. We did find that most institutions reported, 44% reported that they went directly to OLAW, but they did also notify the PTE either separately or as a CC on the OLAW letter. And then only 12% reported directly to the PTE with a request for them to pass it on to OLAW, and 9% reported directly to OLAW and did not notify the PTE at all. And so we thought that these were really important things because these really play into data quality and our ability to reuse some of this data at later points in time. If you could please go forward 2 slides, Sarah. So what did we end up learning from that 2019 webinar? We realized that using the subaward as the final solution wasn't necessarily the right solution at that point in time. One of the things that also surfaced from the conversations, not just through the webinar, but other dialogues that we had, was that there were oftentimes understandings or misunderstandings, I should say, between the OSP and the Office of the IACUC about certain terms, about how data or information should flow, and certain information about business processes, as well as miscommunications between participating institutions about what their roles and responsibilities might be between themselves and a participating institution. And some institutions were very much in favor of using the subaward to flow down MOU terms, and some institutions were not at all in favor of doing that. So we realized that one thing that we wanted to do was to build consensus among institutions to reduce confusion by moving people to a more common vocabulary and help people see some of the issues from both the OSP side and the Office of the IACUC side, and to reduce burden either in issuing and or reviewing MOUs or other documentation. Next slide, please. So we convened a working group, and the working group took a 2-pronged approach. And the first thing that we did was we worked on guidance that was there to help us interpret the requirements and help create space to get different offices on the same page. Examples of questions that you might want to ask at your institution if you weren't sure what your current business process was, and to cut through some of the administrative red tape, and then understanding how institutional practices around MOUs, how to first define and identify that, and then also understand, can and should you change some of those processes. And then we also wanted to come up with a sample MOU because we wanted to identify what were some of the roles and responsibilities that NIH OLAW was talking about in their in the guide, and what does that actually look like on paper for different institutions. And we were also very fortunate in the working groups to have strong and thoughtful representation, not only from OLAW, but also from USDA and the VA, who both also strongly advocate for documentation either in the form of an MOU, which I believe is the VA, or again, USDA, having some sort of a documentation about the understanding between 2 parties related to animal care and use. And so we wanted to have that sample product for institutions to be able to use across a variety of funding agencies. And we did feel that the MOU was a good place to start, because the MOU is something that, even if your institution did decide that they wanted to, wherever possible, incorporate this into subawards, there may be situations and settings where having an MOU template helps to streamline review of either incoming MOUs by understanding what your institutional position is, and or being able to issue outgoing MOUs in some of the examples that I talked about earlier, where funding is not necessarily exchanging hands, and yet there is an exchange of expectation about the care and use of animals that will be used, in particular if it's related to federal funding. Next slide, please. So we put those documents together. We put them out onto the FDP IACUC listserv and the compliance listserv. We got a lot of really great, robust comments and feedback in 2021. And then we recently wrapped up our review of that early in 2022 and posted the completed resources on our website. And today is really just an opportunity for us to be able to talk to you a little bit and make sure that the community is kind of aware of these documents, understands what they are, what they're intended to do, and how to use them. So first thing we wanted to do is let you know where these completed resources are. I put the breadcrumb trail up there at the top and highlighted that in red. And then on the IACUC page, you can see it's actually right underneath the Universal Protocol template. And there's the original webinar recording that I referenced earlier, including those poll questions, slides to that same webinar, the FDP MOU sample, and as well as the guidance document that came about. Next slide, please. So we wanted to highlight a couple of things about the MOU. It is designed for single projects, but can actually be modified for institution-wide assurance for frequent collaborators. So I'll give an example. If you are in a university in Boston, we often have labs within labs. You might have a floor of a hospital building that belongs to Hospital A, and then the second half of that same floor might belong to Hospital B. And so, you've got a lot of stuff, kind of ideas and resources pollinating between those different areas. And so you might find it far less burdensome to have an institution-wide assurance to say, this is how, unless we specifically call it out otherwise, we are going to assign roles and responsibilities related to vertebrate animal care and use, whether funded or unfunded. And you could certainly use the same form for that. So if people are thinking about, will this add additional burden? I think also some of the regional context about your most frequent collaborators might be useful to think about. Who do you collaborate the most with? Would it be more helpful to have kind of an institution-wide assurance with those individuals? And so while the sample itself has been designed for single use, you can easily modify it, and there is guidance in the guidance document about how to do that to make it an institution-wide assurance that does not require specific protocols. And then we looked at specific areas of concern for regulators, and this is where our federal partners really came in handy. We thought about program-wide acknowledgements, transportation, ownership and oversight, investigation and reporting. That reporting piece is obviously very important. And then we did create an other blank section because we always have those very unusual circumstances that come up whenever we're collaborating with other institutions. There's always kind of those wild cards. Next slide, please. And just to make it clear, that is actually a Word document, the MOU, so you are able to very easily modify it. We do typically, it is a sample document, so if you modify it a lot, please take the FDP moniker off of the front. But otherwise, it is a sample, so people are permitted to kind of use it a little bit more broadly. And some of that, again, is covered in the guidance. Few highlights from the government guidance is that it is intentionally non-prescriptive. We tried to think of the guidance as an opportunity for offices to translate between each other and between various functions, and provides considerations for offices in choosing what instruments to utilize, such as MOUs, subawards, IIAs. And that was really important because some institutions felt very strongly about the use of MOUs versus subawards. And then it also provides high-level considerations for institutions to think through how that collaborative research could be documented, and some good use cases are in there in the FAQs as well. Next slide, please. So the next steps, the sample MOU developed by the working group will be shared with OLAW to allow dissemination to grantees through the website and potentially via a webinar. I've talked to Axel a little bit about that, and that would be something really exciting for us to do as a next step. This would also make the sample MOU available to a much broader community, including international organizations and or for-profit entities and non-FDP members that are maybe consumers of OLAW information but not yet familiar with FDP. And then we've talked in the working group about communicating with broader audiences such as Incura, SRA, the 3 Eyes, and then maybe hosting a webinar through FDP to get a little bit more into the weeds on this document and answer more questions. Next slide, please. So now it is time for questions, and I did see that there were some that came up. Okay.
So I think Beth was asking about possibility for creation of a document that could be appended to the FDP subaward template. And it sounds like through your analysis, you determined that now was not the right time. Do you think that there could be a right time to create that, or to create that as an option for those that really wanted to be able to use the subaward agreement for this?
Yeah, I think it's a wonderful question. And I think where we really came down on it is, in order to achieve the goal of potentially even going back to the subaward subcommittee and saying, let's make an attachment 7B in case you got 7 that is currently the human subjects data is an attachment 8 or 7B, and have that be for vertebrate animal use. First, we needed the MOU to define what should appear in that attachment. And so by having this sample MOU, it is certainly a possibility that we could go back to the subaward subcommittee and ask to form a working group in consultation with them that would have a sample MOU that is streamlined to the maximum extent possible, and then be able to attach that for those institutions that would do that. I think one of the other things that we were also considering with that was learning some lessons from the DTUA and the human subjects data attachment. Certainly some institutions really like using that attachment, and other institutions are not in favor of using attachment 7. And so we wanted to have this opportunity to start socializing some of the thoughts, the concerns, and the analysis that might have to be done at institutions if they wanted to start looking into streamlining some of this.
Great. Thanks so much, Amanda. So I'm just gonna move on, if we could, to the next slide, because I know we have 5 minutes left. Maybe the next slide, actually the next 2. So we're going to try to leave some time today for discussion at the end related to some of the new requirements folks may be aware of related to the responsible conduct of research, or RCR training. And we just have a few minutes left. But I think just to set the stage a little bit, as folks might have heard previously, or from Jean's update yesterday related to NSF, the CHIPS and Science Act does include some expansions on the requirements for the responsible conduct of research training. And the primary 2 expansions are in the WHO. Faculty and other senior personnel will now be required to complete RCR training, and the what. In terms of subject matter, this now includes mentoring training to raise awareness of research security risks, federal export control, disclosure and reporting requirements. And some of this is not really surprising given the regulatory landscape related to research security right now. But it does pose our institutions some challenges in how to best think about implementing some of these new requirements without introducing unnecessary administrative burden. And we do have some time to think about what FDP might be able to do to facilitate compliance while mitigating additional administrative burden. So Sarah, the next slide, please. And these changes haven't become effective yet. We're still waiting for some additional details from NSF on timeline and the specifics of the requirements. But this is, I think, a space where FDP potentially could consider some demonstrations. If we think about virtual versus in-person type of content delivery, or how to make the content more digestible, how to make it more meaningful, so that it isn't just doesn't just feel like checking a box, but still checks the box. This is something that we're going to kind of keep on the radar. And if folks have any ideas, we would love to hear them. Share those ideas on the research compliance listserv. I think earlier in the chat, I shared the link to sign up for any of the research compliance listserv or any of the other listservs that you're interested in. I think we'd love to start the conversation on how FDP might be able to help in this space. So I know that we are short on time, so it doesn't allow for a whole lot of conversation, but to get the juices flowing, because we'll definitely talk about this next time. And then, Sarah, I think the next session today is also the last session today, and that is the faculty forum at 4:30. Or then the next session tomorrow morning is sub-awards at 11 o'clock. Does that sound right?
Yes, you got it all correct.
Great. So thanks so much to everyone for joining us today. I hope to see you at some other sessions and to see you next time.